Pro FinSimple offers flexible financing solutions for all kinds of businesses, whether you're an electrician or run an organic farm. Because we know that your business demands financing that works when you need it, like when your landscaping company lands a new account. Wherever you see your business headed, Ford Pro FinSimple can help you pursue it with financing solutions today. Get started at fordpro.com/financing.
Stop. 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 Had enough? Kick out mucus and quiet the cough with Mucinex 12-Hour DM for long-lasting cough and chest congestion relief. Buy Mucinex 12-Hour DM at your local retailer. Use as directed.
Welcome back to the Philosophemes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. I'm proud to be part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Thank you for being here. I spend so much time paying attention to true crime that I thought it might be interesting to put together a philosophy and true crime episode. I rarely miss a day of court TV, and so I am referring to this trial in the same way that court TV refers to this trial. Court TV refers to this trial as the Cult Baby Murder Trial. So I'm calling this episode Philosophy and True Crime Number 1, the Cult Baby Murder Trial. All right. There are two aspects of this case that call out for philosophical discussion. The first is the not guilty by reason of insanity question, and the second is the Google searches that came up during this trial. So Chloe, the person on trial's name is Chloe Driver. Chloe was clearly engaged in thinking through a philosophical puzzle. So this episode is divided into 3 parts. After a quick disclaimer, first, we will briefly get up to speed on the case. Second, we will discuss the question of not guilty by reason of insanity as it relates to this case in particular. And lastly, we will discuss the philosophical puzzle Chloe was trying to solve, as suggested by her Google searches, and examine how the philosophical puzzle relates to the question of not guilty by reason of insanity. All right, so here's the disclaimer. As always, please remember that we're not doing cultural politics or religion on this podcast. I am not an attorney, and nothing I state on this podcast should be considered legal advice. Also, nothing in the episode should be construed as medical advice. I'm not recommending you do anything. I have no personal connection to anyone involved in the Cult Baby Murder Trial. I think one of the concerns that immediately arise when discussing true crime is that we don't want to glorify crime or criminals. But true crime is very popular and an important part of the collective consciousness. So we are not engaged in any sort of advocating for criminality. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, I started working in the world of mental health in 1999, and I was explicitly a forensic monitor in Ohio, assigned to districts 6 and 12. I've sat in on more competency hearings than I could ever count or remember. Plus, I just want to give a quick shout out to Vinnie Politan. Every night I'm watching Vinny on Court TV and VPI, or Vinnie Politan Investigates. After that, I also watch his show Accomplice to Murder whenever I can. I believe I've seen every episode of 48 Hours, Dateline, and Paula Zahn that ever aired. And I've seen pretty much all of the niche shows on Discovery Plus, like, for example, American Monster. There are probably many days nowadays that I spend more time looking at true crime than I do looking at philosophy. So it just made sense that eventually I'd do some sort of philosophy and true crime run on the podcast. All right. So according to the summary posted on Court TV, quote, Chloe Driver accused in the death of her 13-month-old daughter. Chloe Driver is currently 24 years old and is facing multiple charges, including malice murder, in the December 2020 death of her daughter, Hannah. While responding to a 911 call, police discovered Chloe and Hannah in a bedroom, both suffering from stab wounds, reported the Cherokee Tribune and Ledger News. An indictment accuses Chloe of stabbing Hannah in the neck multiple times with a knife. Chloe has pled not guilty by reason of insanity, stating in court documents, quote, the defendant was in the midst of a psychotic episode that included paranoia, delusional beliefs, hallucinations, and disordered thinking, end quote. According to her defense, Chloe was living a nomadic lifestyle. The defense said several witnesses could account for her mental health issues and subsequent deterioration in the weeks leading up to Hannah's death. In opening statements, prosecutors said Driver was one of 3 women married to Benjamin Ben Michael, who lived a nomadic and religious polygamous lifestyle. That's where the word cult comes from. Several people consider him a cult leader. Evidently, that's why this is called the cult baby murder trial. Chloe and Benjamin are the parents, or were the parents, of the baby Hannah. Driver's defense said those beliefs, coupled with mental illness, led Driver to psychosis that resulted in the death of her daughter. Chloe is standing trial on charges of murder, cruelty to children in the first degree, aggravated battery, and aggravated assault. So, at the time of recording this, the jury is currently deliberating. So by the time you find this episode, the jury may have already rendered a decision. On day 1 of the trial, the prosecutor told jurors that Chloe understood the wrongfulness of her actions, and Chloe's defense attorney told jurors that Chloe, quote, took a paring knife from a butcher block in the kitchen of the home, grabbed her daughter, locked themselves in an upstairs bedroom where she committed the heinous act of murdering her daughter, end quote. The defense then suggested that Chloe was having a mental health crisis at the time she committed the act, and that she is therefore not guilty by reason of insanity. So we're going to talk about Chloe's Google searches in just a moment, but it may be helpful to get clear here on the philosophical logic at work in these 2 arguments, both for and against Chloe's guilt. All right. Whenever the topic of not guilty by reason of insanity comes up, and I'll probably start using the abbreviation NGRI, whenever it comes up, the conversation always starts off with what is known as the McNaughton Rule. I wrote a paper on the McNaughton Rule in graduate school while taking a philosophy of law course. The McNaughton Rule is also referred to as the McNaughton Test, and it states that, quote, everyone is presumed sane, and to establish a defense on the ground of insanity, it must be clearly proved that at the time of the committing of the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason from disease of mind so as to not know the nature and quality of the act they were doing, end quote. In other words, they lacked the capacity to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. The McNaughton test originated in 1843 in England, and this case, known as the cult baby murder trial, is taking place in Georgia in 2024. So it's helpful to recognize Georgia's modified McNaughton rule, and it states that a defendant cannot be found guilty if they lacked the mental capacity to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. That's some excellent LSAT logic work right there. Notice Georgia, instead of saying someone is not guilty, Georgia is saying that a person cannot be found guilty. So they're not saying that someone is not guilty. It's a subtle but important logical distinction, of course. All right. So I have no idea which way the jury will go after they complete their deliberations. However, I can speculate based on the evidence, the facts of the case, and from watching the trial. There are two pieces of evidence that, in my opinion, weigh very strongly against Chloe Driver being determined NGRI. And we're going to look at those pieces right now. So within the first 48 hours of the event, and after having already been Mirandized, Chloe wrote statements on pieces of paper since she was unable to speak due to her self-inflicted wounds. One of the statements she wrote was a question. The question was, quote, "How long will my prison sentence be for killing her?" End quote. So that's going to be hard to get around. So the second one here, let's take a look at these Google searches. According to Fox 5 News, quote, investigator Deanna Jarrett of the Cherokee County District Attorney's Office also took the stand to discuss the search of Chloe's cell phone. She testified that among her phone activity, Chloe had searched with the following 3 prompts. 1, quote, killing someone to save them, end quote. 2, quote, killing because the world was fake, end quote. And 3, quote, how to snap a neck, end quote. All right, so we want to focus on Chloe's second search, but let's say something about the other evidence first. It's not difficult to see how someone could read her question regarding how long her prison sentence will be as not just an admission of guilt, but more importantly regarding what is in dispute in this trial, it may be seen as an admission of knowing right from wrong. Likewise, it's not difficult to see how someone could read her Google searches as indicating premeditation. And of course, the reason why that is important is because if someone premeditated an act, then it is difficult to support the claim that they committed the act in the midst of a crisis, not knowing, for example, what they were doing, and therefore that they should be deemed NGRI. Looking at the second of her Google searches, quote, killing because the world was fake, end quote, may indicate the philosophical puzzle Chloe Driver was engaged in thinking through. Now, this philosophical puzzle is becoming more and more popular nowadays. In fact, I believe it will continue to become even more popular the more we continue to increase our ability to insert technology into our lives. I have written a bunch on this, and what I have written has ruffled some feathers. However, as time continues to pass, my predictions are being revealed as correct in the Social Epistemology and Technology volume. I think it was volume 3 in a social epistemology series coming out of the Social Epistemology Collective. I gathered together a wonderful group of scholars from all around the world, and they submitted chapters for that book. When the book came out, there were some people out in Silicon Valley that got pretty upset. I'm not going to get into it here. If you want, you can go over to the Social Epistemology Collective website and search for my name, and you'll see my response to the people in Silicon Valley who had some unfavorable and really unfair things to say about our book. But I stand by the comments in our book, and I stand by the predictions that were made in our book. All right. So in regard to the philosophical puzzle, this philosophical puzzle is the philosophical puzzle of simulation. Am I a fortune teller or a mind reader? I don't think so. Rather, there is a very clear logical structure at work. And once you see that logical structure, it becomes possible to make predictions based on witnessing patterns in real time. It is as if you can see symptoms indicating where on the logical trajectory the present moment of history can be found. So philosophically speaking, the puzzle Chloe Driver's Google search indicates may be referred to as the central question of simulation theory, namely, quote, "Are we living in a simulation?" end quote, which is another way of asking about the truth of reality. For example, is reality fake? Or, as Chloe Googled, is the world fake? I find that people who are philosophically savvy or versed in the history and tradition of Western philosophy, they make a clear distinction between reality and the world. There's not an either or logic between the two there, but there is a difference between the word reality and the world. But people who are not versed in the history and tradition of Western philosophy tend to use the word world to refer to reality, at least mind external reality. But I mean, I've talked about this in YouTube videos, but I'll put something together eventually, I believe, in a podcast, because I think it's really helpful to recognize all these distinctions. But I would not equate the world with reality. I think reality is a much wider term. Well, we'll talk about it down the road here. All right, so what we want to do is to get a deeper understanding of the philosophical puzzle identified by the question, is the world fake? And as we get a deeper understanding of this puzzle, we want to make sure we also consider how this puzzle relates to the question of being deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. Because, as we'll see by the end of this episode, there is a strange logic of self-reference at play in the relation between this puzzle and the question of being deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. Let's jump in. In 2020, I wrote a book on simulation theory with my friend and colleague, Dr. Jason M. Pittman, and I plan to have him as a guest on the podcast very soon. I'm really looking forward to that. Through our research, watching tons of videos, documentaries, and reading books and papers, we identified a 3-part structure to simulation theory. In other words, if you wonder if the world is fake, it turns out there are only so many ways that the world could be fake. So it's possible to ask how Chloe Driver understood the world to be fake. The names we gave to the 3 ways to understand simulation theory are actual, virtual, and mental. So in the case of Chloe Driver, we could ask, when Chloe asked about killing in a fake world, how did she mean the term world? If she meant something actual by the term world, then all the thinking that would follow in regard to the philosophical puzzle of simulation would be taking place within the category of simulations understood as actual. And the same goes for the other 2. So if Chloe meant something virtual as opposed to actual when she used the term world, then all the thinking that would follow in regard to the philosophical puzzle of simulation would be taking place within the category of simulations understood as virtual. This is extremely important, of course, because each of the 3 types of simulation are constituted by different logics. This is straightforward, so hang with me for a moment. It should all light up for you in just a moment. It's like if we were to say we were going to play a game, and there were different ways we could play the game. The different ways to play the game are different because they have different rules. We find this in all sorts of games, like, for example, checkers, chess, backgammon, poker, and so on. In fact, before playing these games, we may even need to get clear on what rules we are playing by before we start. Can you jump backwards in checkers? Is castling allowed in chess? Are we playing Fisher 960 chess or King of the Hill chess or 3-check chess? So in the exact same way, what we are doing is asking, how did Chloe understand her use of the term world in her question about, quote, killing in a fake world, end quote? Her question, philosophically speaking, is actually an interesting and legitimate question. So rather than ask Chloe or the clinical psychologist hired by the defense how Chloe meant her question, we can follow out the logic as it is found in each of the three fundamental categories of simulation theory, as we examine how simulation relates to not guilty by reason of insanity. All right, so how does simulation relate to not guilty by reason of insanity? I watched many hours of the court trial for this case, and I really want to point to two moments that are highly relevant to our discussion. The first is when the defense's clinical psychologist was being cross-examined, and the second is when Benjamin's first wife was providing testimony. Both of these moments come from day 5 of the trial. I was ecstatic when, in response to the clinical psychologist from Kent State discussing Chloe's cult-related behaviors as mentally ill on day 5 of the trial, the prosecutor asked the clinical psychologist if she has ever studied or had ever studied Plato and Socrates. This happens at hour 6, minute 14 on day 5 of the trial. The prosecutor cross-examining the clinical psychologist then said, he then asked her if she had studied any of the existential philosophers, and he mentioned them by name, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Sartre. So again, I was ecstatic. I was like, all right, I picked the right case. So he then asks her explicitly if she had studied Immanuel Kant or Soren Kierkegaard. At which point you can just imagine, those are he just hit all the right names, as far as I'm concerned. All right, so at 6 hours and 45 minutes then, the clinical psychologist reported that Chloe carries diagnoses of schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. So the takeaway from these diagnoses, assuming, of course, that they are accurate, is that they refer to chronic, severe, and persistent psychological disturbances. That's highly relevant for not guilty by reason of insanity because they differ from acute psychotic disassociations and disconnections with reality. In other words, her mental health history may garner some jury sympathy, but it won't meet the criteria for not guilty by reason of insanity, right? Being diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or being diagnosed with schizophrenia is not a get out of jail free card, right? It's not a, you're just allowed to do whatever you want card. At the same time, the defense seemed to be pushing an understanding of Chloe's relationship with the father of the daughter she killed by calling his first wife as a witness and asking her how Benjamin treats his significant others. So, at 8 hours, 27 minutes, and 36 seconds, Benjamin's first wife had the following to say under oath. She claimed that Benjamin, quote, puts crazy ideas into the minds of others, end quote, causing them to, quote, question everything about reality, end quote. She clarified, quote, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but then it's like your reality is totally broken apart, end quote. Now, when she speaks of breaking reality apart, it does sound like she's suggesting Benjamin can induce dissociative or psychotic states. However, she also clarifies that this is really like heavy skepticism or gaslighting. So this in itself won't prove that Chloe meets not guilty by reason of insanity criteria. This is a great point of entry into the different ways to question reality. For example, if you question whether reality itself is real, this is the deepest level of skepticism regarding the world, then you're suggesting something like the tree in the yard and the sun in the sky are not actually real. From a philosophical point of view, this is an extremely difficult position to defend or explain because, as we discussed in the episode on the relationship between absurdism and nihilism. How is it possible that everything is fake, but you're somehow able to make accurate judgments about its lack of reality? The only way this could be possible, if you want the deeper dive on this, you can check out my book with Dr. Pittman, Artifacts of the Simulation. But for the purposes of this podcast episode, I'll just point out the following. The only way the actual simulation could be possible, meaning every single thing is fake, is if we are in a situation like The Matrix. But notice, even in the movie The Matrix, there was still a real world, a real place, somewhere where your body would be plugged into the Matrix or the fake reality, which immediately changes the actual simulation into a virtual one, right? As long as there is some actual reality somewhere that is not fake, then you're not living in an actual simulation, you're living in some other kind of simulation if you are living in a simulation. So it's kind of like the people who confuse absurdism with nihilism. It would take a very sophisticated, very nuanced argument to try to claim that we're living in an actual simulation, that reality itself is a simulation, mainly because there's just no way to figure it out, right? There's no evidence that you can point to that just would immediately suggest that could be the case. But when you shift to a virtual understanding of simulation or a mental understanding of simulation, and this is why I say that, or this is why Dr. Pittman and I both say that these different types of simulation have their own logics, because once you switch to a virtual or a mental kind of simulation, then the way to argue for them shifts, it changes, right? So we'll take a look at this. If what I had said previously doesn't make sense, then I'll explain what I mean. As long as there's a base reality somewhere, then that is actual reality. And so if there is an actual reality, then the simulation isn't actual. The simulation is either virtual or mental. So that actual reality isn't fake. So again, it's very difficult to try to argue for an actual simulation. And as I had mentioned, most people, whenever they try to do so, they end up getting themselves into the same kind of situation they get into whenever they treat absurdism like nihilism, right? It's just a confusion of categories. Thus, whatever it is that you're considering fake, since it isn't actual reality, it must be some virtual manifestation of reality. All right. So much for actual simulation. In my opinion, the only people who argue for actual simulation are those who haven't thought through the philosophical position they are arguing for. Yet, on the other hand, virtual simulation is a plausible philosophical position. For example, if you follow social media misinformation, then you are relating to a world that isn't real. If you are making decisions based on a false belief, then there is a sense in which you are living in a fake world. Often there are those courses being offered to us on YouTube ads, for example, and they will claim in the ads that they were able to implement some strategy and make $1 million in 2 minutes. Then they show you a graph and it looks like, man, they just crushed it. So you click the link and before you can enter their site, you have to acknowledge that, this is the fine print of course, that you understand everything they say is for entertainment purposes, so that the graph you just looked at that persuaded you to click through turns out could be totally fake. It explicitly says this in the fine print if you just read the fine print. And the spokesperson's claim to have gained however much money doing whatever they claimed could be totally fake. So yeah, that's pretty much living in a fake world, and 2 more quick examples. If you're watching a sporting event and you think that the outcome is based on merit, in other words, you think the best person or the best team will win, if it turns out that the game is rigged or controlled in some way to predetermine outcomes, then the event you're witnessing is fake. It's a virtual simulation. The people are real, but they are not really competing. They are simulating competing. They are simulating a sporting event. Of course, I'm not an attorney, but I know many attorneys, and nearly all of my friends that I speak with regularly are attorneys. So I'm not trying to say anything necessarily negative about attorneys. This just happens to be a very real and very helpful example. So, many attorneys will offer you a free consultation. And the point of that consultation, they will explicitly tell you, is for you to ask them questions so you can decide if you want to hire them and pay them a retainer. So when you go in and have this free consultation with them, you've probably prepared some questions and you are trying to figure out if they can help you or not. So it's pretty obvious that you will base your decision on whether or not to hire them based on the answers they give you to your questions, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the free consultation. Okay. So after they've answered your questions, if you like their answers and you decide to hire them, you'll need to sign a contract with them and pay them a retainer. When you read that contract, it will say that any agreements that you may have had with them prior to signing this document are null and void, whether verbal or written. Let that soak in. In other words, I mean, it's their contract. They wrote the contract. They know what was in the contract before you started your conversation with them. So they knew during that conversation that they could technically promise you anything, and if you decided to hire them, they wouldn't be obligated to fulfill any of those promises. Now, of course, we all hope that everyone has good intentions, but there is still evidently a need to sign a contract. And the contract does in fact contain that language. So while you're relying on good intentions, they have the full weight of the law behind them. You, of course, do not. This is another perfect example of how during the free consultation, you are living in a fake world. You are believing that the answers you are hearing to your questions are grounded in something real. But as soon as you sign that contract, then you realize that you're in their world now. And you don't know what is real and what is not real. In fact, you only know what they tell you, and, well, you see the kind of contractual agreements they make. Talk about going through the motions. Some people would say that that's exactly the same as a humanities department selling you a degree and encouraging you the entire time while you're paying them, even though they know that you're just throwing your money away. There's lots of ways you could argue. I mean, it's cosmetic. But they have to keep selling you a worthless degree so that they can keep their cushy lifestyle. That's why it's fair to say that Ponzi schemes are another example of living in a fake world. When you are investing in a Ponzi scheme, you believe you are being financially responsible and you are contributing to a better future for yourself. But in reality, you're financing some jerk's cocaine habit. So that's an example of living in a fake world. The world you believe you are living in isn't real. Yet, notice that even though these practices are morally suspect and in some cases fraudulent, none of them qualify you to be not guilty by reason of insanity. So even if you are living in some kind of virtual simulation, keep two things in mind. A virtual simulation, by definition, means that there is a true reality somewhere, no matter how eclipsed it may be currently. And it does not give you a free pass to commit murder. Though these examples could be described as gaslighting, recall Benjamin's first wife's description of his behaviors, and the ideation involved may resemble psychotic states such as dissociation, they are technically not necessarily psychotic states. I would go so far as to say that stress may induce psychosis, but being lied to in and of itself isn't sufficient to induce psychosis. If that were the case, we'd all be psychotic after learning the truth regarding the Easter Bunny. Lastly then, of the 3 types of simulation is the mental type of simulation. This type of simulation tends towards solipsism, which again we looked at in the previous episode on the difference between nihilism and absurdism. When Dr. Pittman and I were researching our book, the first example that immediately jumped at me once we identified the mental type of simulation is something called Capgras syndrome. It's named after the psychiatrist who discovered it. Sometimes psychotic people will believe that something like aliens or demons have abducted and replaced a real person or real people. This is called Capgras syndrome. In such cases, when asked why they murdered a loved one, for example, a psychotic person may truly believe that they have not murdered their loved one. Rather, they have killed the alien that was posing as the loved one. And often they believe the loved one is already dead or safe somewhere else. Now, that's a mental simulation. And this particular instance sounds like an example of psychosis. Like I said, mental simulation can be intricate and nuanced, but it's pretty close to solipsism. Right? Everybody else thinks that these people are the real people, but you think that they are aliens, shape-shifting aliens or something, right? I've met people who believed reality to be a video game, and they were the only main character. Now, that's not just a kind of solipsism, it's also a mental simulation, right? The simulation isn't located anywhere but in their mind. So therefore, the simulation is mental. We could argue that this is different, for example, from a Ponzi scheme, because a Ponzi scheme, the simulation is virtually real. Multiple people can be involved in it, and as they are checking into it, like a folie douce, right? Not the musical version, and they can check into it as a kind of community and be under a delusion altogether. Notice none of these examples provides a satisfying characterization of the context of Chloe's Google search. However, now that we've seen the different types, we can notice that, given her comments after the killing event, she was most likely asking her question in the context of virtual simulation. Again, this doesn't excuse her behavior, nor does it constitute her as not guilty by reason of insanity, but it's helpful to think through this for a moment. There is a deep sense, and I think this is the relevance of the prosecutor's cross-examination questions regarding philosophy, there is a deep sense in which religious and philosophical belief in an afterlife render materially incarnated existence a kind of virtual simulation, a kind of virtual reality. Stick with me. This isn't difficult to understand, so let me just state it in a different way. If the soul is immortal and it goes to another place, so to speak, after death, then if that place is its true home, or if that place is where it will be eternally, then it makes sense to think of the soul's temporary incarnation as a kind of virtual reality in relation to the soul's true home. We might even imagine ourselves in that place, for example, heaven, remembering our experience of being incarnated as if it were a dream compared to our being in our true home. This is another way to think that the world may be fake. And in this context, Chloe's question is actually deeply philosophical. On the one hand, she could see her actions in this material world as having caused, I know it takes two to tango, but we're trying to think from Chloe's first-person point of view here. She could see her actions as causing her daughter Hannah to have to exist. There's a professor from the Catholic University Fordham who is good friends with someone who coined the slogan, quote, "Life is a sexually transmitted disease," end quote. Notice how, in this context, though, of course, There are many other thoughts that would need to be considered philosophically before we could just settle on this as the absolute truth. And rather than consider all of those thoughts here, I'll just tell you that this puzzle is undecidable. It's a matter of faith, not knowledge. So we're not going to philosophize our way to a certainty regarding this puzzle. Yet this is the immediate context that I thought of when I heard Chloe's Google search. There are countless places throughout the canon of Western philosophy where legit, not simulated, philosophers ask this question. The wisdom of Silenus speaks directly to this even. So it is possible to articulate a philosophical position from which it could make sense to Chloe, even though it would still be a matter of faith for her and not certain knowledge, that she could believe that she had birthed her daughter into a lower soul condition, that her actions were directly responsible for causing her child to manifest into a virtual simulation. Seeing as how the only way out of the virtual simulation is death, Chloe could also have reasoned to the conclusion, that is to say, that in the context of a virtual simulation understanding of reality, Chloe could also have reasoned to the conclusion. In other words, it could be considered rational for her to arrive at the conclusion that killing her daughter was the best possible outcome for her daughter. This is like when people die by police officers shooting instead of suicide. It's like saying, well, I got to get out of this virtual simulation, but some ways of exiting are better than others. If, in fact, the way I exit influences how I arrive in the real place that comes next. I mean, that isn't inconsistent with many mainstream religions, even though you'll probably never hear any of their figureheads present it in such a frank way. So I guess that's one good thing about being a real philosopher. Real philosophers can be frank with you. And so, again, notice that a Google search asking if it is okay to kill someone to save them from a fake world, that Google search in itself does not mean the person Googling it is psychotic. It doesn't even mean they are mentally ill. So I think the prosecutor was absolutely right to bring up the existential philosophers, especially Plato and Kant, because, Plato himself essentially walks us through such thinking, right? Think about the cave allegory.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
Therefore, the clinical psychologist was revealing a bias to suggest that such Google searches should count as evidence toward not guilty by reason of insanity. With that in mind, then, we can quickly notice the historical and traditional context in which this discussion fits. Paraphrasing the central question of simulation theory toward Chloe's language, instead of asking, do we live in a simulation? Rather asking something like, do we live in a fake world? How does that question relate to the history of Western philosophy? This is, surprise, surprise, the logic of post-humanism again. St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, if you prefer, emphasized the distinction between the city of God and the city of man. I continue to think this is the correct context for Campanella's The City of the Sun, by the way. But we'll discuss that in another episode. Notice how quickly the logic of posthumanism, as I've been referring to it, can capture and illustrate these distinctions for us. Across the history and tradition of Western philosophy, we can discern these three cities or worlds. They are the city of God, the city of man, and the city of post-human, or the post-human city. So another way you could say this is the city of God, the city of human, and then the city of post-human. According to the logic, for humans living in the city of God, they are living in a world that makes meaning regarding existence by relating it to God, and that is absolute. If you have a difficult time hearing the word God, we can articulate this in purely logical terms and just say an eternal, unchanging point. The philosophical logic would remain the same, and the philosophical logic is traditional and, as I like to say, rock solid. Next, then, is the city of man, or the city of human, and it is, in contrast, relative. It's not absolute, it's relative. In other words, meaning is not made in the city of human by relating the experience of existing to God or to an unchanging, eternal being. Rather, meaning is made by relating it to the limits of human imagination. That is, by relating to something relative, not absolute. Following this logic all the way out, then, we arrive at the post-human. And as I've noted in countless places now, meaning making at this level is so relative that it is considered nihilistic from the other points of view. That's why it's called post-human, because rather than understand existence as up against the absolute limits of God or the relative limits of human imagination, the post-human city makes meaning regarding the experience of existing in accordance with whatever the current limits of technology may be. And keep in mind, technology is understood here in a very wide sense. It's not just machines, it's AI and its chemical and biological interventions into humanity. So everything from stem cells to steroids and everything in between counts as a kind of technology pushing the boundaries, the limits of being human. All right. So being born into a post-human world and asking if it's better to just remove yourself from the post-human world is a rational question. How one acts upon their answer to that question may not be rational, but asking the question is rational. It's philosophical, and I'm not encouraging anyone to do or not do anything. Back in 2016, they asked the Amish what they thought about American politics, and an elder from the community said, quote, "We are living in the end times," end quote. Now, many people might hear that and think it's, I'm trying to be colloquial here. I'm not trying to be disrespectful. They might think, wow, that's crazy. But notice, if you believe in the city of God and believe the city of God has degenerated, or use whatever term you like, I'm just trying to speak from their position. If you believe the city of God has become the city of post-human, well, then, yeah, that would signal that it's the end times for what you believe to be the humans. So, moving through these thoughts is a good philosophical exercise, but if we were to boil this down to one point, we'd say none of this thinking will excuse murder. You can ask the central question of simulation theory all you want, but if you have a theory of right and wrong, even if that theory is relative to the context or kind of simulation you believe you may be living in, you still know the difference between right and wrong. If Chloe truly believed the world was fake, I personally would think that she wouldn't trust others enough to ask them questions regarding her prison term for murder. Moreover, it would be reasonable for us to ask her, hey, if the world is fake, what makes you think your daughter isn't fake? Right? A question poised between virtual and mental simulation, so to speak. Meaning, how she answers that question tells us what kind of simulation she is taking as the context of understanding inside which she is thinking. All right. So I have a bunch more, like a philosophical analysis of the term illness and so on, but I was thinking this is long enough for one episode. We covered a lot of ground here. The Chloe Driver case, known as the Cult Baby Murder Trial, is truly a tragedy. You would think Chloe could have let Hannah grow up and decide for herself if the world is fake, whatever that means. And attacking defenseless people is subhuman. I guess you could say it's post-human. But either way, any philosopher, with the exception of the absurdists, of course, if they can even count as philosophers, any real philosopher should hold themselves to a higher standard than that. All right, pop over to YouTube and let me know what you think. Let me know if you'd like for me to make more philosophy and true crime episodes. I'm sincerely asking. I have so many irons in the fire right now that I'll never live long enough to get all this work done. So your feedback helps me make decisions. Sincerely. Thank you for being here. I hope your holiday celebrations are blessed.